In the early summer of 1940, nearly 400,000 British and French soldiers were trapped on a single strip of French coast, with the sea at their backs and the most powerful army in the world closing in for the kill. What happened next was so unlikely that people at the time simply called it a miracle. An army marked for destruction was carried home across the sea by a fleet of tiny boats. It was one of the great turning points of the war, and it began with a catastrophe. This is Dunkirk. It is a story of a nation's darkest hour, and of the ordinary people who helped turn a crushing defeat into a legend. To understand it, you have to go back to the spring of 1940 and the 6 devastating weeks in which Hitler's army conquered Western Europe. In May 1940, Hitler's armies launched their attack on the West, and it went even better than the Germans had dared to hope. German tanks punched through the forested hills of the Ardennes, exactly where the French believed an attack was impossible, and then raced for the sea. In a matter of days they reached the English Channel, and in doing so they trapped the best of the British and French armies in a shrinking pocket up in the north. Cut off from the rest of France, with the Germans on 3 sides and the sea on the 4th, the trapped armies fell back toward their last hope, the port of Dunkirk. It looked like the end. If those hundreds of thousands of men were killed or captured, Britain would have no army left to defend itself, and the war might be as good as lost. Winston Churchill, only days into his new job as Prime Minister, faced the very real prospect of losing the entire British army in a single stroke. The men had marched and fought for weeks, falling back through Belgium and France, and now they were penned into a strip of dunes in a burning town, simply waiting for the end to come. And then at the very moment of triumph, the German tanks stopped. On May 24th, with his panzers less than 15 miles from Dunkirk, Hitler issued one of the most debated orders of the entire war: halt. The reasons are argued over to this day. The marshy ground was poor for tanks, the armored divisions were worn out and needed for the next phase, and Göring, the head of the Air Force, had boasted that his planes alone could destroy the trapped army. Whatever the true reason, the pause was a priceless gift. It handed the British a few precious days, and they would use every single hour of them. For several days the Germans largely held back on the ground and left the killing to the Air Force. It was a mistake that would help save an army. Back in England, the Royal Navy launched a desperate rescue, code-named Operation Dynamo, run from tunnels carved deep beneath Dover Castle. At first the plan looked almost hopeless. The Navy hoped that, at best, it might save perhaps 45,000 men before the port fell for good. Destroyers and larger ships crowded into Dunkirk harbor to load troops from a long stone breakwater called the Mole, but the harbor was under constant, murderous attack. German dive bombers, the Screaming Stukas, plunged on the ships in the crowded beaches, and the port itself became a wreck of burning oil and sunken vessels. Black smoke from the blazing fuel tanks rose thousands of feet into the sky, a vast dark column visible for miles, and by day it actually helped screen the beaches from the bombers. That single stone mole, never built for such a thing, became the lifeline of the whole operation, with ship after ship tying up alongside it to load thousands of men under fire. Out on the open beaches, the scene was almost beyond belief. Tens of thousands of soldiers waited in long, patient lines that stretched right down into the surf. They stood for hours, sometimes up to their necks in the cold water, under bombing and strafing, waiting for a boat that might carry them home, or might never come at all. The beaches shelved so gently that the big ships could not get close. Somehow, the men had to be ferried out to the deeper water where the destroyers were waiting. Men formed human chains out into the waves, passing the wounded from hand to hand, and even built rough piers by driving lines of trucks out into the sea at low tide. And so they abandoned everything: guns, trucks, tanks, all of it left behind or wrecked on the sand, as an entire army stripped itself down to nothing but the men themselves. And still discipline held. Long lines of men waded out and stood chest-deep in the sea, waiting their turn as the shells fell around them and the planes came screaming down. The great problem was those shallow beaches, and the answer to it became the most famous part of the whole story: the little ships. A call went out across southern England for any boat that could cross the channel, and they came, hundreds upon hundreds of them. Fishing boats, pleasure yachts, lifeboats, river ferries, tugs, even paddle steamers, more than 800 small craft in all, many of them crewed by the ordinary civilians who owned them. These little boats could run right up onto the beaches. They ferried men out to the waiting warships, or simply packed themselves full of exhausted soldiers and set off back across the sea for England. Day and night through the bombing and the wreckage, that strange armada shuttled back and forth, lifting the army off the sand a few dozen men at a time. Some of the little boats made the crossing again and again, their civilian crews turning back into the fire long after they could have simply gone home. For many of those crews, it was the most frightening thing they would ever do. For the soldiers they carried, it was the whole difference between a boat home and a prison camp. High above, out of sight of the men on the beaches, the Royal Air Force fought a savage battle to keep the German bombers off the ships. The exhausted soldiers, bombed on the open sand, often cursed the airmen they could not see, but the RAF was there, high and inland, bleeding the Luftwaffe to protect the escape below. And all the while, a rearguard, much of it French, held the shrinking perimeter around Dunkirk, fighting a desperate delaying battle so the men on the beaches could get away. Every hour that thin line held meant thousands more men lifted off the sand, and every hour it held was paid for in blood. Many of those men would never leave France. The rearguard bought the evacuation with their own freedom, and most of them marched off into years of captivity. Day after day the impossible numbers climbed, not 45,000 but 100,000, then 200,000, then more. It became the greatest seaborne evacuation in history. An entire army pulled out through one wrecked port and a few miles of open beach. By the time it ended on June 4th, Operation Dynamo had carried more than 338,000 men back across the Channel to safety. Around 200,000 British soldiers and more than 100,000 French snatched from the very edge of destruction. The exhausted, filthy, unshaven survivors poured into the ports of England, and to their astonishment, they were greeted not as a beaten army, but as heroes. Crowds lined the railway stations, handing the soldiers tea and sandwiches and cigarettes, cheering men who had fully expected to come home in disgrace, if they came home at all. The whole nation felt it. Against every expectation, the army had been saved. People spoke of it in hushed tones as a miracle, the miracle of Dunkirk. But Winston Churchill was careful to remind everyone of the hard truth. This had been a rescue, not a triumph. Wars, he warned, are not won by evacuations. It had been a shattering defeat. France was falling, and Britain had lost nearly all the guns, tanks, and vehicles of its main army, abandoned in the sand at Dunkirk. And yet the men themselves, the trained, experienced heart of the British Army, had come home, and as long as that army lived, Britain could fight on. They had lost a battle, but they had kept an army, and in that summer of 1940, with Hitler the master of Europe, that army was very nearly all that stood in his way. A few days later, Churchill rose in Parliament and turned that survival into a promise of pure defiance. He vowed that Britain would fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields and the streets and the hills, and that it would never surrender. Dunkirk was a disaster transformed, by courage and by a fleet of little boats, into the very reason Britain was still in the war at all. And because that army came home, 4 years later other armies would cross the other way, over the same gray sea, to begin the liberation of Europe. The spirit of those days, of ordinary people sailing straight into danger to rescue their own, became part of what Britain believed about itself for generations after. Next time we go beneath the waves of that same ocean, to the longest battle of the entire war, and the wolf packs that came within a hair of starving Britain into surrender, the Battle of the Atlantic.